The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Julian Zelizer is a Princeton scholar of Lyndon Johnson as well as the civil rights movement. He says civil rights activism is no longer as organized or coherent as it was when it sought and won passage of the Voting Rights Act. And we say hello to Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, also the author of the book The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Julian Zelizer, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Much has been said about the accuracy of the movie Selma. As someone who has chronicled those years in your new book, did President Johnson take an undeserved shot by the filmmakers?
I don't know if it's an undeserved shot, but I don't think the filmmakers captured how committed Johnson was to voting rights by early 65. The fact is, after he's reelected in November of 64, Johnson tells his attorney general to be Nicholas Katzenbach to draft a strong voting rights measure so it's ready to go. In February of 1965, a month before Selma, Johnson is having his people negotiate with the Senate leaders over a voting rights bill. And the main difference that Johnson has with Martin Luther King is when to propose the bill. Should they move immediately or move later? And that's not the kind of difference that I think comes across in the movie if you don't really know much about the period. So I think there are problems with the portrayal, but it's still a phenomenal movie. And I urge people to see it to understand how the marchers in Selma were able to put pressure on Congress to act sooner than Congress was willing to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, since LBJ and Martin Luther King were partners in winning passage of the Voting Rights Act, does it really matter who said and did what along the way?
I think it matters to John. I mean, it matters just in terms of understanding the history. That's certainly important. And it's important to understand where a president stood on the important issues of the moment, whether we're watching this through a movie or whether we're reading it in a textbook. But it also matters in just understanding how the civil rights movement had transformed public opinion and political opinion by 1965, which was really a huge accomplishment. They had moved the nation through protests, through encountering the violence of the South, to the point where the President of the United States was standing behind this legislation, even if he was not yet ready to push it forward. And that matters too. And finally, for Lyndon Johnson, I think a lot of people who study his presidency, it's been decades where most of the discussion is about Vietnam, and now we're turning back to his domestic accomplishments. So I think a lot of either supporters of his or students of his presidency want people to understand really the very significant domestic legislation that took place during this period, and they worry that the movie might give you the impression that this was not really central to his presidency.
Now, given Johnson's political origins as a segregationist and the difficulties he had with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the 1964 convention, wouldn't it be understandable that civil rights leaders in '65 might have been a bit wary of him? They were.
They were very wary of him throughout. They never knew exactly where he stood. Many were always suspicious that really he was a conservative in liberal clothing. That said, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, even with what happens at the Atlantic City Convention, there are still many civil rights activists, including King, who believe this is the real deal, that this is a president, despite his Southern background, who's willing to invest a lot of political capital in pursuing these kinds of bills. So even when that suspicion lingered, even when there were parts of the civil rights movement that in the end wouldn't trust Lyndon Johnson, there was a huge contingency that thought he was more liberal than any president they had seen on race relations, including John F. Kennedy.
You made this point a moment ago about the movie depicting historical tensions between presidents and grassroots supporters who want to push further, and that's good. You raised the question as to who makes history, political leaders or political activists. So what is the answer?
They both do, but I do, in this book that I just wrote, one of my major arguments is that presidents are limited in terms of power, and ultimately it takes grassroots activism, and it also takes big elections like we saw in 1964 to create moments in Congress where presidents can get things done. And the whole theme of my book is that if we focus too much on presidents and focus too much on what the quote-unquote great man is able to do, we miss how important the environment is and how that environment in Washington can constrain any president, even one as savvy as Lyndon Johnson. So Johnson really depended on the grassroots. He depended on the electorate to give him a Congress that had been gridlocked for years that was finally willing to pass legislation.
We're speaking with Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and he is the author of the book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Is pressure from activists now going to push President Obama where he had not gone before on issues like the economy, the environment, immigration? Do you see that happening?
Well, I think the moment is off. So, the thing about the pressure in the 1960s, it was very organized, it was very powerful early on, and it culminates with this 1964 election that gives Lyndon Johnson these huge liberal Democratic majorities. Whereas now, the kind of activism we're seeing right now is taking place in an era when you have a Republican Congress, an obstructionist Republican Congress, and there's going to be limits at this point to how much the activists can do. I also don't think we have the kind of activism we saw in the 1960s, which was just, in terms of numbers, it was huge. In terms of leadership and associations, it was very organized and very coherent. And I don't think we have that kind of pressure right now on the Congress to help Obama through. So I don't think he has the same kind of assets on the ground right now that will be useful to him.
It almost seemed like we were going to get close with Occupy Wall Street in this regard, but every time you saw footage on it, or if you happened to be in an area where some of this activism was going on, there were signs for everything you could think of in terms of what people were fighting for or protesting against. Is that the type of focus or is it the type of focus that people need? You need to pick one subject and not 50,000 different things to protest and rant about?
I do think there's something to that. I mean, coming back to Selma, what's remarkable is how the activists all focused their attention on the issue of voting rights, but then connected the activism through people like King to a very specific piece of legislation that they wanted Congress to pass. And so even with what became very chaotic on the ground in terms of the violence that they encountered, there was still this bill they were talking about, and they could build pressure for that bill. They could get media attention for this issue. And I do think if activism just means almost everything at once, it's harder to get the kind of political momentum that you saw in the 60s. Even the anti-war movement against Vietnam was pretty coherent in its focus about what war it was protesting and what it wanted to bring to an end. And I'm not sure we've seen that in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Is there any precedent for a two-term president who lost both houses of Congress in his sixth year to be as bold as President Obama is now? I mean, does he have a chance of accomplishing anything, or is he, just kind of having fun? Doesn't have any pressure on him at this point.
The odds are low. I think even on the Republican side, Dwight Eisenhower tried to really campaign for a balanced budget in the late 50s after Democrats had control of Congress and liberals had made these great gains in 1958. And he didn't get really far in trying to cut domestic spending. Currently, Obama, he does have executive power, and he's showing that if he wants to use that, he can make some gains, but it's going to be very difficult for any kind of legislation like he saw early in his presidency when Democrats controlled Congress. It's not simply that Republicans have control, it's that the Republican Party is not open or not feeling any kind of political pressure internally to compromise. So there's no electoral dynamic pushing toward bipartisanship. There might be some legislation that passes, but you're not going to have another New Deal, you're not going to have another Great Society, and you're not even going to have what Obama had in those first couple of years.
Looking ahead to 2016, you've written that Hillary Clinton needs to be challenged by Elizabeth Warren. Why?
I think it's good. I mean, one of the flaws in Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2008 was a bit of too much comfort and unwillingness or not feeling the necessity to really test out arguments and to demonstrate exactly what she was about because of this inevitability that she felt, which ultimately was knocked down. Now she's not really going to have a challenger unless someone like Warren steps forward. And I think it would actually be good for her in the primaries. I think it would help her build her electoral muscle. It would help her sharpen her arguments so she's ready for the general campaign. And I think there's something valuable to the fight of a primary to get ready for the general election. And I think in many ways she would come out stronger rather than weaker.
Is there any risk to splitting the party like we seem to see on the Republican side, though?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the Democrats are very determined to win the White House for another term because they understand they need to protect the programs that President Obama has built. So that means come general election, even if there's divisions within the electorate, I think the unhappiness with the Republican Party and the determination to win the White House would bring that party together. Look, 2008 was incredibly divisive for Democrats, and more than I think a Warren-Clinton campaign would be. And in the end, the Democrats put President Obama in office.
Okay. Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. The name of the book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Julian, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Today, CEOs of big corporations are playing the tricky inflation blame game. Publicly, they moan that the pandemic is slamming their poor corporations with factory shutdowns, supply chain delays, wage hikes, and other increased costs. But wait, inside their boardrooms, executives are high-fiving each other and pocketing bonuses. What's going on? The trick is that these giants are in non-competitive markets operating as monopolies, so they can set prices, mug you and me, and scamper away with record profits. In 2019, for example, before the pandemic, corporate behemoths hauled in roughly $1 trillion in profit. In 2021, during the pandemic, they grabbed more than $1.7 trillion. This huge profit jump accounts for 60% of the inflation now slapping U.S. families. Take supermarket Goliath Kroger. Its CEO gloated last summer that, quote, a little bit of inflation is always good in our business, adding that, quote, we've been very comfortable with our ability to pass on price increases to consumers. Comfortable indeed. Last year, Kroger used its monopoly pricing power to reap record profits. Then it spent $1.5 billion of those gains not to benefit consumers or workers, but to buy back its own stock. A scam that siphons profits to top executives and big shareholders. Or take fast food purveyor McDonald's. It bragged to its shareholders that despite the supply disruptions of the pandemic and higher costs for meat and labor, its top executives had used the chain's monopoly power in 2021 to up prices, thus increasing corporate profits by a stunning 59% over the previous year. And the game goes on. We're going to have the best growth we've ever had this year, said a Wall Street banking titan. This is Jim Hightower saying, hocus pocus, this is how the rich get richer.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Historian David Chappell talks about the post-Martin Luther King trajectory of the civil rights movement, which he says may have only been a historical artifact with Dr. King as the central figure. And we say hello to University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell. He's the author of a new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. David Chappell, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's great to be back.
Yeah, nice to have you with us. You say in your book that most people don't think there was much of a central narrative or rhythm to the civil rights movement after Martin Luther King. Was there one, or did civil rights progress in fits and starts?
Oh, I think I think we see a kind of false continuity or trajectory. As the years from the Montgomery boycott in 1955-56 through the Voting Rights Act and the Selma March in 1965. We see a kind of simplistic trajectory from crisis in the streets to confrontation at the national level and resolution with radical history-making legislation. And, that's the movement itself was never that predictable, and people never felt that they were on a straight track of progress towards those victories. There was a lot of luck, a lot of contingency, even during those heyday years of tremendous victories and surprising victories. So I think, in a sense, the post-King years that I write about in my book are not really that different from the years of King's heyday, in that history is always kind of messy and unpredictable and hard to trace. It's just that without a central figure to help us oversimplify events and developments, the post-King years are, maybe we're more frank and realistic in our ability to see it as disjointed and unpredictable.
Is the civil rights movement a historical artifact now with Dr. King as its symbol?
I think it is. I think it's also a very real thing, and I think it continued, disjointed and moving, hither and thither, lurching in different directions, as it clearly did after King's death, after the 1960s. I think it's very real and very realistic to speak of a movement with an ever-churning and evolving population of rank-and-filers in the streets. I think it's nonetheless something that people feel, and rightly feel, they're a part of. They're a part of historical precedents and legacies, and they are very rightly, self-consciously, taking up an agenda, taking up items of unfinished business that their predecessors, including Dr. King, believed passionately in.
You dwell on the book on some of Dr. King's successors. Chief among them is Jesse Jackson. How do you assess his role in the history of the movement?
Well, I wouldn't say he's chief among Dr. King's successors. There's certainly a period there in the mid-1980s when Jackson is gobbling up a lot of the attention, and the media, as they had previously elevated Dr. King and perhaps oversimplified the movement by making King appear to be a singular symbol of it. Jackson is fulfilling King's legacy, or stepping into those shoes. But I think that there are many leaders and organizations that are carrying on King's legacies. There are many moments when projects like the National Black Political Conventions in 1972 and 74, about which I have a chapter in my book, the Crusade for Full Employment legislation in roughly from 1974 to 1978, which Jesse Jackson is a part of, but by no means the most prominent part of, and by no means the most prominent leader of. The campaign for a Martin Luther King holiday, which again Jackson is a part of, but I think a distinctly minor part of. Those episodes are moments when the legatees of the civil rights movement, the people who want to keep the flame burning, aim for radical, history-changing national legislation and institutional change, structural change in the politics and economics of the nation, and those are vital moments. And in those moments, the question of leadership itself is very much in play. Back to the National Black Political Conventions of 1972 and 74, especially. A lot of people who organize those, black elected officials and civil rights leaders, are saying that we have to get away from the idea that one national leader can or should represent this vast population of diverse political and economic interests, what we now call the African American population. There's no reason why you'd have one black leader. Nobody expects white America to speak with a single voice. And it's interesting to me that, in a way, the racism of the country helped sustain the idea that there's just one voice of black America, even when it's coverage in the media that's sympathetic to the civil rights movement and sympathetic to Dr. King and Dr. King's agenda, which sometimes the coverage was. It's still a reductive, racist impression that that Black America is speaking with one voice, and I think it's a mark of the success, ironically, of Dr. King and all the people that he has come to represent. It's a mark of their success that's really no longer tenable. That Jesse Jackson, even at his strongest moments, could never plausibly be seen as the leader of Black America the way that Dr. King could be.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell. He's a scholar of the American civil rights struggle and author of a new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. David, a lot of younger listeners might not realize that Dr. King faced a good deal of opposition in his later years to his anti-war stance and his growing militance about confronting the government about poverty. Do you think he was on the right track when his life was cut short?
Well, certainly the issues that he targeted are issues that have remained with us and remain unsolved. The problem of poverty, and I think people who take that issue seriously see racism as integrally bound up with the problem of poverty in this country, though, of course, it's a problem that also transcends race. And today, as in King's Day, the majority of poor people in this country are not African American. I think that it's very important to recognize that King had fierce opposition in his day, not just at the end of his life, by the way, but all through his life. And not just from the people you'd expect, the Southern conservatives, the out-and-out racists and segregationists, but a lot of liberals, and a lot, not just white liberals, but black liberals also thought that, he had a Messiah complex, that he was a loose cannon, that he was pushing too hard, demanding too much too soon. He was too radical, and that he'd only provoke backlash. All of these criticisms dogged King throughout his public career from the mid-1950s until he was gunned down in 1968.
You write also about Dr. King's personal failings, namely adultery and plagiarism. Do you think any of that has really tarnished his overall reputation, though? No.
I talk to people, even professional historians today, and, people who you'd think would remember these things. A lot of people can't remember the huge controversy in the early 1990s over the discovery of evidence, irrefutable evidence that King had plagiarized significant parts of his work when he was in graduate school at Boston University, including his dissertation. That whole agonizing public discussion just seems to have been forgotten. And I go through it in the book, looking for some explanation as to why it hasn't had much of an impact on King's legacy, on his national reputation. Some opponents of the Martin Luther King holiday did attempt to bring those discoveries, those revelations about King's academic dishonesty to bear on the debate. And, it might have helped the opposition in some states for a while, but the King holiday, the trend, first with the final passage of the national legislation in 1983, and subsequently every state at one time or another having some version of a statewide King holiday as well. That took a lot longer. But, people to this day celebrate, most people, there are some exceptions, celebrate and honor King on his national holiday every year. As for the revelations about his adultery, it's a more complicated case in many ways. People do tend to remember that. They don't necessarily have a very strong opinion about it, perhaps because we've had so many revelations about so many other prominent national figures, extramarital adventures, shall we say. And I think that, Americans tend to yawn or, their eyes glaze over in such discussions. But I think it hasn't really damaged King's reputation. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon, given, again, how controversial, how widely and deeply feared and hated he was in his own day, that when that stuff wasn't publicly known, when, a few people knew about the adultery, but it wasn't publicly discussed. It was not publicized until the late 1980s, and nobody knew about his plagiarism except perhaps Dr. King himself. He has become, as sometimes happens with leaders who are shot down mid-career, mid-stride, he became, pretty quickly much more honored and respected and even loved. The opposition to him dwindled and finally evaporated. I think we had a strong resurgence of it during the national battle over the King holiday and some of the state battles in states like New Hampshire and Arizona, where resistance to the state holiday remained strong. But, again, after those last gasps of it, it ultimately did die down, and it just isn't considered respectable in polite company to, or certainly in the national media, to denounce King personally, or to claim that he consorted with communists, or to even to raise those. I think it's considered somewhat crass or impolite to bring up his personal failings.
Mm-hmm. All right. University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. He is the author of the new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we look forward to doing it again soon.
Well, you're most welcome, Jim, and thanks very much. Great to talk to you.
Great talking with you as well. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Peter Baker, thank you for joining us on the Bill Press Pod, and welcome.
Thanks for having us, Bill. It's good to talk to you.
Oh, I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Well, and I have to say, congratulations on your new book, The Divider. It really is, first of all, I think it's a culmination of the great reporting both of you have done about the Trump presidency of the last 4 years. It's really a masterpiece of journalism. I was amazed that having lived through this and covered it and wrote and talked about it myself, I still learned a hell of a lot about the Trump presidency from your book. So really good. So, Susan, let me start with you. I guess it's safe to say that never in our history have we had a presidency that came anywhere close to the Trump presidency.
Look, we've had all kinds of, liars and charlatans in public office, of course, in the American experience. But Donald Trump is an outlier in so many ways. And of course, it's in that catastrophic ending to the Trump presidency that you see that most clearly, which is to say he's the only president in American history who has refused to accept the results of an election and has actually sought to overturn a legitimate election, defying the Constitution. That's never happened before. But I think when Peter and I set out to write The Divider, part of it was to not just focus on this culmination, this violent, awful culmination of the Trump presidency, but to make the case that this was almost the inexorable conclusion, an inevitable conclusion of this 4-year war that Trump had waged on American institutions.
Well, in fact, that is the very first sentence of the book, which I found just about the most important sentence of the book, right? That what happened, as you point out, eventually on January 6th, wasn't just some aberration, right? Peter, it was, we could have foreseen it, I guess, from the way the whole Trump presidency was laid out, and that this was to use your phrase again, the inexorable culmination.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, that's the important thing, that we were building to this moment the entire time.
Yeah.
4-year war on institutions and norms and traditions. And so no other book has tried to do what we try to do here, is to explain January 6th, not just in the context of the moment, but in the context of the entire presidency. And we should have probably, a lot of people did see it coming, but I think even then it was hard to believe that it was possible that you could have somebody who was so immune to the standards and the norms and the beliefs of a system that we've had now for a couple hundred years. But that's where we were. So by the time January 6th happens, we should have all understood what was coming, partly because he told us it was coming. And even without the inside information that this book provides, he was fairly transparent. He said as early as May of 2020, he wouldn't accept any election result other than a victory. And if it was a defeat for him, that meant it was rigged. So he telegraphed very early on what his plan was. And again, every step along the way of his presidency, you could see in some way or another how he was setting this up.
And it's pretty clear, I thought, that there were two characteristics of the Trump presidency, which you come back to time and time again in the book. One of them, Susan, zero regard for the truth. Right?
Well, that is a fair statement, really. This is a president, after all, who I think the Washington Post assessed more than 30,000 times in the course of his presidency that he made misleading or otherwise untruthful statements. But it's more than that. I mean, it's a kind of lying as pathology that is so extraordinary. Again, we've had liars as presidents before. It's the commingling of a fantastical array of untruths that really sets Donald Trump apart. We experienced that ourselves in the two different interviews we conducted with Trump for this book over 3.5 hours. At times, he was contradicting himself, even in the same sentence, within seconds of each other. He told us at one point that the Secret Service had stopped him from going up to the Capitol with his crowd on January 6th. Then like 90 seconds later, he said, no, I never asked the Secret Service. And then seconds after that, I said, well, actually, they stopped me from going. How do you even, what's to believe, what's not to believe with Donald Trump? It's a pathology with him.
You mentioned, I think it's your second interview with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, where he started out with another big lie about a COVID vaccine ad. Peter, tell us that story.
Yeah, exactly. So when we first went to see him was a few months into the Biden presidency, when everybody was sort of taking the vaccine, but a lot of his own supporters were reluctant or skeptical. And we asked him, would you do a public service announcement to tell them that you think this is a good thing, since he took it and he claimed credit for it. And he said, yeah, the Biden administration asked him to do that, and he was thinking about doing it. So, okay. 7 months later, fast forward, we go back for our next interview, and he'd never done a PSA. So we asked him, well, whatever happened to that PSA you were going to do for a vaccine? Well, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, you were the ones who told us. So, it was a remarkable thing. Was he lying the first time, or was he lying the second time? Or did he just forget, or is he just living in a different reality? I mean, this goes to the heart, in a way, of both two things. One, his, as you say, tenuous relationship to the truth, and the question of whether he's lying, he knows he's lying, or he just gets, caught up in these reality bending experiences. Or the second part is, though, how he's captive to his own base. He was afraid of getting too associated with something that he could have bragged about as his biggest accomplishment, because his base was mad at him. They even booed him at a rally about it. So suddenly, instead of being a leader of his base, he's a follower.
Susan, there are a lot of words that I have used and a lot of words I've heard other people use to describe Donald Trump. Of all the many words that one could use, some of them unprintable, why did you decide on, the two of you, on the divider?
We were looking for something that really expressed something about Trump as a person as well as a political figure, in part because he created this remarkable cult of personality around himself. And the story of Trump in the White House that we're attempting to tell is both the story of a politician, but also a guy. And what's remarkable is that Donald Trump is a divider in his personal interactions with people. It's his personal philosophy of how to get ahead in the world, and it's his political recipe for success as well. So it had the effect of drawing together so many different themes around Trump in the White House. Donald Trump divided his own family. He divided his staff members against each other. In fact, that's literally his management philosophy is divide and conquer. And you saw that in the constant toxic infighting of his aides and his family members. This was something that was encouraged by Trump. He had an almost gladiatorial view of life in the Oval Office. He wanted people to fight it out in front of him. He, of course, encouraged the political combat instincts of institutional Washington as well. Whenever there was a chance to double down on something that was divisive or controversial, Trump would take that chance. He was never going to pull the country together. And also that's what makes him stand out compared with all of the other presidents of our modern recent memory. They may not always have succeeded, but they all aspired to unite the country. They saw that as part of the role of being the president. George W. Bush actually literally spoke of being a uniter, not a divider. Barack Obama said there is not a blue America and a red America. There is a United States of America. Bill Clinton talked about his goal of being the repairer of the breach being the partisan breach in the country. And again, of course, they fell short, but that was what they saw as fundamentally the role of the president. Contrast that with Donald Trump and his message in his inaugural address of American carnage.
Yeah. Peter, that was a time when some journalists, but a lot of politicians were saying, well, yeah, he was a divider during the campaign, but once he gets to the White House, man, right, he's going to do like other presidents and want to bring everybody together. As you point out, that hope disappeared in the inaugural address, didn't it?
Pretty quickly. That's right. I think there was a not irrational hope that he would be something different than he presented on the campaign trail, because he wasn't somebody who was rooted in particularly ideological terms. He wasn't a partisan in the past because he'd been a member of every political party multiple times, right? He switched parties 5 times. He was pro-abortion rights before he was against abortion, pro-gun control till he was against gun control, pro-higher taxes on the rich before he was for lower taxes on the rich. So he had such an ideological flexibility that there was this hope that, okay, fine, he's from New York. He's not like a hard Republican conservative. He'll be willing to deal with people across the aisle because he had to do that as a builder in a democratic city. But that proved to be wrong. That, in fact, he had decided to throw his lot in with the right wing of his party because that's where he saw the people who were most faithful and loyal to him. And he decided on a base-only strategy basically for the rest of his presidency.
Does he believe in anything, Susan?
Well, he believes in Donald Trump. He has, in fact, great confidence in Donald Trump.
Right. No, I mean, again, I kept looking for that for his core beliefs. I never found them. Maybe you can help me out. The other thing that struck me, so maybe if he doesn't believe anything, he doesn't know a lot either. I mean, as early as page 5 in your book, right? I found this paragraph, if I can read just a little bit of it, about Donald Trump. What he did not know. He did not know that Puerto Rico was part of the United States. Did not know whether Colombia was in North America or South America. Thought Finland was part of Russia. Mixed up the Baltics with the Balkans. He seemed, I'm just jumping. He seemed generally surprised to learn that Abraham Lincoln had been a member of the Republican Party. Well, it's astounding what basic stuff he didn't know.
I have to admit that is actually one of my very favorite paragraphs in the book. So, so thank you for that dramatic rendering of it. The thing is, by the way, he not only confused the Baltics and the Balkans, he did so in a meeting with the leaders of the Baltics for maximal insult. But it's not just ignorance. We have had American presidents who didn't know stuff. Bill Clinton was never really comfortable with foreign affairs till well into his second term. Barack Obama was a very junior senator who had very little Washington experience under his belt. You can read briefing papers. You can learn stuff, although, of course, Trump was famously uninterested in hearing briefings, never mind reading them. The difference is that Trump was so arrogant. He didn't care. It wasn't just that he was ignorant. It's that he believed it didn't matter. And that expertise was something to be devalued and dismissed because he was the expert on literally everything. Peter was there at the CDC in the beginning of the pandemic where Donald Trump actually said, well, he knew a lot about medicine because his uncle had been a professor at MIT. By the way, he wasn't even a professor of medicine. His uncle was a professor of physics.
You also offer some insights into Donald Trump, the person, which I found humorous and interesting. His obsession, among other things, with his own personal image, with whenever photos were taken, how what angle was shot and the lighting, getting the lighting right and everything. Is that the television producer in him, Peter?
Yeah, it's all about creating an image. It's all about creating the mythology of the great man, right? He was fixated on lighting. He would correct, TV people when they came for interviews and say, no, you want to put the lighting here. He would look at the iPads to look at what the lighting looked like before he began an interview. His very first day, he comes into the Oval Office, and the first thing he says is not, wow, this is a place where great decisions were made, or wow, this is a place where FDR or Reagan or JFK were. His first thing he says in there, how did they get the lighting to do that? And it was an obsession of his. But it's all part of this idea that he liked to promote, that he was a great man. So much so that it was, he was never he never admitted any kind of weakness. At one point, one of his aides said, the president looks a little tired. And she was corrected by another aide saying, no, Donald Trump is never sick and he is never tired. And that's part of his, mythology that he likes to create, a function of the 14 years of the Apprentice, when he created a figure that didn't actually match reality. But that was the way he succeeded in entertainment and the way he succeeded at politics.
Now, I must say, one thing you do in your book, which I've not seen anywhere else, is you detail how Donald Trump fixes his hair every day, which I have wondered about as every time I see him, how long it takes and what the process is. Susan, do you care to spell it out? It's pretty detailed and a long time getting that hair just right, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's actually kind of remarkable, given the results.
I know.
This could be not only is it labor intensive, but it's very striking that Donald Trump didn't trust anybody else to do his hair, that he's doing this remarkable operation on himself, including to the point of using almost cartoonishly oversized scissors to the kind you use at shopping mall, ribbon cuttings to cut his own hair. And often you notice it gets a little bit long and he has that sort of aging rocker, Allman Brothers kind of feel to it. But, the amount of hairspray, there was a very specific kind of hairspray that his personal aide had to carry around everywhere with him. Wherever Donald Trump went, he does this sort of elaborate comb over / flip in order to obscure the thinning thing, the coloring. I mean, it's all what's amazing, again, from a man who is so obsessed with image that he would put all this effort into something to come up with something that looks so bad.
As I recall from reading this, I mean, what you described, it all has to go forward, right, first, and then some up at the one side, and then it flops back. I don't know. It's a three-way process, as I recall. But
that's right. And the flip is very important because if you don't get it right, then it all sort of, droops and looks really, really scary.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.